You are listening to The Reference Desk, the Wicomico Library's podcast that connects you to your public library.
Welcome to a spooky special episode of the Wicomico County Library's Reference Desk podcast. This month, we're going to be telling 3 spooky stories from the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland. Today, I am joined by my co-host Amy, and also we'll be joined by a special guest, Will, from Pittsville Library, who's going to tell his own story for the podcast. So sit back, grab a cup of tea and a warm blanket, and listen to our tales. When you think about haunted Eastern Shore, one of the most prolific and long-standing stories come from a certain area in Worcester County, usually known as the Forest. This, of course, is the Wicomico Forest, Wicomico Reserve, whatever you want to call it. For years and generations, this place has been the center point for so many stories of creepy happenings and coincidences that are just can't be coincidences. When you consider the scariest of fairy tales, the most common setting is a thick forest or maybe a swamp. The setting is just so easy to imagine. The sense of isolation, being totally alone with oneself. Human beings tend to reject such experiences. Being alone makes us uneasy. Many people can't stand to be alone. They turn on the television when they fall asleep, or they have a radio wake them up in the morning. Music plays in their car, and is even stuck into their ears when they walk or cycle. Few people want to be alone, facing only their own company. Distractions blot out that sense of aloneness. Imagine you're on your front porch at night. The stars are out, the moon is shining, and all of your neighbors are asleep. All the street traffic has stopped. You are alone at your home, experiencing the silence of the night. You stand in the presence of yourself alone. Does this scare you? Now imagine being on a deserted road in a deep forest. You're on a bridge that crosses a swamp. There are silhouettes of trees growing out of the black water and thick vines hanging from the branches. A bright moon casts some light on the forest, but only enough to see shadows. Nothing is really clear in the landscape. You know that you are completely alone. Nocturnal birds make the only sound you hear, except the occasional rustling in the brush, possibly made by swamp critters. Why does that setting feel so different? Is being alone in a swamp or a forest a scary thing? Or is it that our senses are keener in a natural setting, and we can feel what lies beyond the edges of the physical world more readily when we are surrounded by the life forces uninterrupted by the development and man-made things? So one of the stories I grew up listening to as a child, my mom was actually from Wicomico, raised in Wicomico, and she liked to tell us scary stories about the Wicomico Forest in particular, which is why I'm choosing that one to do today. And one of the ones she told me when I was a kid that scared the bejesus out of me, thanks Mom, was the Heavy Bible story. And if you've already heard it, it's a really neat one. So, and there's a little tidbit I'll tell you at the end. This one's called the Heavy Bible. Shortly after the Civil War, Purnell Pusey and his wife donated some land in the Wicomico Forest near Furnace-town to the Methodist community. The old Nazareth Church was built on the site, and it operated for nearly 70 years as a small country church. Members of the Pusey family, as well as others from the community, were buried in the graveyard that flanked the simple church building. In the mid-20th century, the Methodist Conference stopped recognizing the small church, and it was abandoned. As time passed, the empty church and graveyard became associated with haunting tales, phantom figures, and stalking the graveyard, bleeding headstones, and other strange happenings. But the most famous of the tales related to this church was that of the Heavy Bible. The little white church in the woods was said to have a Bible that stayed on a lectern near the altar, and different stories vary on where the Bible was placed. If a person lifted the Bible and tried to walk away from the lectern, the Bible would get heavier until it was too heavy for anyone to actually hold. Therefore, it could never be removed from the church. One of the commonly told stories is of 2 boys who stole their way into the abandoned church at midnight, intending to break the spell of the Heavy Bible. They removed it from the lectern and started to carry it to the door. The Bible became burdensome, and when the boys got halfway down the church aisle, the weight of the book overpowered them. But when they began to move back in the direction of the lectern, the heaviness lifted. They replaced the Bible and left the church terrified. Another account is of 2 men who, like the boys, failed to remove the Bible, yet still gave it a second try, using a wheelbarrow. They rolled the wheelbarrow up to the lectern and carefully placed the Bible in it. As they started to push it down the aisle toward the door, the wheelbarrow became too heavy to push. Halfway down, it wouldn't budge, and appeared to be on the verge of collapsing under the weight. As the 2 men started to pull the wheelbarrow back toward the lectern, the weight lightened, and it moved smoothly with no resistance. There are even accounts of men trying to throw the Bible out the window. But when people heave the Bible into the air, tossing it in the direction of an open window, the Bible drops to the floor like a hunk of lead. There are scores of accounts from people claiming to have tried to move the Bible away from the lectern or altar, only to be overcome by the weight. And here are a few of the references to the heavy Bible noted in a commentary collected by folklore students at Salisbury University in the 70s. My uncle went to the church and went up to that altar and lifted the Bible up. It didn't seem very heavy, so he started to carry it toward the door. But as he got closer and closer, that blamed Bible, it got heavier and heavier. Then he had this funny feeling come over him, like the chills and the shakes. So he walked that Bible right back up and scooted out of that place. That was in 1973 by a guy named Jeff from Frankfort, Delaware. The next one is from a person from Snow Hill from 1970. There's a Bible in there that can't be taken out. They say the closer you get to the door, the heavier it gets. No one used that church for a long time. I guess they couldn't move the Bible, so they just left it. The next one's from Bridgeville, Delaware. This person was in Bridgeville named Sherry. The reason they can't get the Bible out is because after they pick up the Bible, they can see a fire outside the window surrounding the entire church. They always drop the Bible. It's a bit different. It doesn't talk about the weight, but just, being scared by the fire outside. The last one I'm going to read is from a guy from Cambridge named Robert. In 1971, there is a church that has a Bible that appears at 12 o'clock midnight. If you ever enter the church at midnight, the Bible can only be taken as far as the door. It will then fade from your hands and disappear. When you look, it'll be back on the podium. The Bible is only in the church at midnight. So there's a few different versions of the story, and it all really comes down to there is a holy scripture, holy text, that is sitting in this church building, and it refuses to leave. Fun little tidbit, as I promised, that church building was actually moved to sit in Furnace Town Historic Site. So if you ever wanted to go see the church building that heavy Bible story came from, you can actually go to Furnace Town and visit, and it's right there. It's the church building. That's when you walk in. It's on the right-hand side. And you can walk in. There's no Bible in the lectern, so no problems there. And maybe it only appears at midnight and no one's there. Who knows? But that's the story of the heavy Bible from the Wicomico Forest. And there are so many stories revolving around the Wicomico Forest, because it is just so many stories that are around, urban legends and things passed down from generation to generation. But you also can find all of those stories in the book that I got the story from, and on Hoopla, called Haunted Lower Eastern Shore. And they also have a Haunted Eastern Shore if you wanted to spread out and read from pieces like Kent Island, Talbot County, Caroline County, and all that. But yeah, you can definitely find this story and lots of other ones in the Haunted Lower Eastern Shore book, and we'll tag it in the description down below. And it's a really entertaining read, and the writing was just so fantastic.
This is Amy, and now I have the tale of Old Ghostlight Road. My spooky tale comes from the Hebron area, Old Railroad Road, and this was told to me when I moved back to the Eastern Shore. I was born here, but we moved around a bit, and then I came back just, when you were getting old enough to drive, and the first thing they told me about was the ghost light on Ghostlight Road, or Old Railroad Road. Now, this takes place around Hebron, and this first started way back when. So in the summer of 1952, locals were disturbed by a weird and unexplained spectral light that began appearing in the deep and forbidding woods along a lonely stretch of country road. It was described as a sort of phosphorescent wash basin. Whatever this thing was that was reported to the newspaper at the time caused viewers to have an uneasy tingling along the nape of the neck. The light, according to an actual police report, bounced back and forth along the back road that connects Hebron with US 50. Or rather, it doesn't exactly bounce, but it can disappear from the front of one witness and then reappear behind them, as reported in the newspaper. From at that time, a trooper, Robert W. Burkhart. Now, the light, which appeared to travel around 15 miles an hour, eluded troopers, and the troopers agreed at the time that the light was not a gag. Longtime Hebron residents felt the appearance of the mysterious light was somehow connected to a hanging of a slave in the woods a year earlier. Others suggested at the time that the ectoplasm was the notorious Patty Cannon, an 18th century slave trader and murderess who lured her victims, estimated between 17 to 50, into a tavern she owned near the Mason-Dixon line and then killed them with arsenic. a professor from Johns Hopkins. He explained that the mysterious light was nothing more supernatural than marsh gas, also known as will-o-wisp or jack-o'-lanterns, can frequently be seen floating over graveyards. There must be a marsh out there, or perhaps a peat bog, the Hopkins professor told the newspaper. The gas is generated by decaying vegetable matter, seeped up from the surface, gathers in sort of a pocket, and is then moved around by gust of winds. So you can choose to believe a acceptable scientific answer, or is to this day Old Railroad Road still haunted by a spectral light that can be seen on a dark and stormy night.
This is Will, and this is the Haunted Historical Society. Located at the top of Chesapeake Bay, Elkton is one of Delmarva's oldest towns. Captain John Smith first mapped the area in 1608 and named it Head of Elk, for the resemblance the converging rivers on the map had to a rack of antlers. Nary a real elk has to be seen. Over the years, the name was shortened to Elktown and finally to Elkton. The town became a busy crossroads in colonial times, with redcoats and revolutionaries alike passing through. With a history stretching back 4 centuries, it's no surprise that Elkton has quite a heritage and more than a few ghost stories. One of the most well-documented haunted locations, ironically, is the Historical Society of Cecil County building. The 3-story brick structure, painted a spectral white, occupies a stately location at Elkton's main street, across from the district court, almost next door to Cecil County Courthouse. Located in the heart of Elkton, 135 East Main Street can be a busy place as history buffs come and go, as well as arts-minded crowd involved in the Cecil County Arts Council, which also has its office and gallery located in the spacious building. A central feature of the building is the large staircase leading to the 3rd floor. The exact construction date isn't known, but the foundation was laid sometime in the 2nd quarter of the 19th century. According to At the Head of the Bay, a cultural and architectural history of Cecil County, Maryland, the building was originally a bank. The first reports of ghostly activity seem to date from about 1955. The building was purchased that year for the use of the county's public library. On occasion, a librarian might be alone and hear footsteps overhead. When she went to investigate, no one was there. Books sometimes toppled from the shelves for no good reason, almost as if someone had walked along and tossed them down. Most unnerving of all, though, the librarians occasionally saw a shadowy figure walking among the stacks. When they tried to track him down, the man would simply vanish. Ruth Ann Johnson was one of those librarians. Now retired after a long career at the library, she recalled that many odd incidents that seemed to indicate the presence of a benevolent ghost or ghosts. There were a few nights when it was very quiet, and we did hear sounds on the staircase, she said. Sometimes you could hear a dress swishing up the stairs. It's an old building, and over the years been many things. Then there was the case of the disappearing chocolate bunny. About Easter, she said, someone brought in a chocolate Easter bunny, which soon simply disappeared from the lunchroom table. It was easy to blame such a small incident on a hungry coworker who wouldn't fess up. But the missing bunny seemed to launch an oddball chain of missing and moved objects that went on for years. Could there have been a mischievous poltergeist with a sweet tooth playing tricks on the library staff? We always felt as if there was a presence hanging around, said Johnson. It's something that's hard to describe because you can't quite put your finger on it, but you realize that you're not exactly alone. When the county library transferred to a new building in 1987, the incidents and the nagging sense of being watched didn't make the move. These odd sights and sounds continued when the Historical Society took up residence. In fact, the number of curious incidents seemed to increase. Some visitors and volunteers, perhaps being more sensitive than others to an otherworldly presence, reported that they became uneasy or even frozen with fear upon finding themselves alone on the second floor, where the historical house housed a museum filled with local artifacts. The eclectic collection seems harmless enough, or is it? There are Civil War uniforms and swords, captured World War II Nazi uniforms, scraps of hair from dead presidents, vacant-eyed dolls, and dresses worn by long-dead children. One theory put forth by amateur ghost hunters is that the Historical Society has inadvertently imported spirits that may be attached to these items of clothing, weapons, and relics. Mirrors are especially known for harboring a spiritual presence, explains John Kilsavage, owner of the Washington Street Book and Antiques in Havre de Grace, Maryland, and a collector of local ghost stories. If someone has donated a mirror from their old house, along with other objects, it's certainly possible that the particular spirit attached to that mirror or objects is now occupying the Historical Society. One mirror in particular, a massive mirror with an ornate gilt frame that dominates the second floor landing, seems to put people on edge. Measuring about 6 feet wide and 10 feet tall, the mirror radiates a creepy aura that defies explanation. Recently, a group of amateur ghost hunters from Cecil Paranormal spent several hours in the Historical Society seeking out a spiritual presence. First, they determined that a former slave cabin relocated to the property was definitely haunted. They moved on to the main building itself and were able to record a voice that seemed to say, "Shh, the children must be quiet." The voice isn't easy to detect, but you can hear it if you know what you're listening for. Could it be that the building is haunted by the ghost of some stern librarian? Another theory about the Historical Society ghost has far older origins. The building is located next to Dr. Mitchell's house, built in 1769. Dr. Mitchell was a staunch patriot during the Revolutionary War, opening his home for the use of a field hospital for wounded Americans and redcoats alike after the nearby battles at Brandywine and Couch's Bridge. Not all of his patients survived, and some were buried on the property. Their graves may have been unwittingly disturbed when the Historical Society building went up more than 175 years ago. Some say it is the ghost of the dead soldiers, or perhaps Dr. Mitchell, who now wanders the building. Some people are skeptical of ghosts, the author included until a short time ago, and have yet to see or experience one. It may be that we skeptics see and hear what we want and simply close our minds to that which we don't accept as being possible. The closest I have come recently to encountering a ghost has been at night among the boxes and shelves of artifacts at the Historical Society. As a member of the Board of Trustees, I'm there frequently and sometimes poke around in the upstairs storage area. Late one night in the winter of 2009, I was conducting research for this very book and was sifting through stacks of old newspapers in the bat room upstairs. Yes, it's named for the winged visitors that sometimes pop up there. When I had found what I needed, I took the crumbling newspapers to the artifact collection work area to photograph some of the pages. As I worked, I kept experiencing the sensation that I was being watched. Unable to ignore the feeling any longer, I asked, "Is someone there?" and felt a little more sheepish when there was no reply. All around me were shelves filled with items out of the past. Hand-carved wooden toys, posters from events held a century ago, crockery, and record books filled with taxes and bequeathments of the dead. It was dim up there under the flickering pale fluorescent lights and cold enough to make my fingers stiff as I turned the pages. Almost on a whim, for no reason that I can think of, I aimed my digital camera out into the sprawling room and popped the flash. I hurried through the rest of my research, returned the newspapers, and went downstairs. As I turned off the lights behind me, I'll admit I was feeling more than a little relieved to see familiar faces at the computers or sorting boxes of photographs that had recently been donated. Much later that night, when I returned home, I opened the photos I had taken of the old newspaper pages on my laptop computer. There was a photo I had taken of nothing in particular, just shooting into the room. To my surprise, I could make out some sort of blurry something in the photo, a kind of hazy blob. It might only have been some trick of air reflecting the flash, but with a shiver I recalled how I had felt that someone was watching me. With the same impulse that made me take the photo in the first place, I deleted it. The photograph wasn't proof of anything, after all, but I won't forget that feeling anytime soon. From the collective experiences and occurrences, it seems that there may very well be a ghost haunting the place, or perhaps even several ghosts carried in on historical artifacts, or else the result of disturbing Revolutionary War dead, or, heaven forbid, the spirit of some stern librarian. This is from Delmarva Legends and Lore.
Thank you for joining us for our spooky edition of the Reference Desk podcast. That was Amy and Will and Vicky reading scary stories, and these stories are all available through various means through Hoopla, and our links will be in the description down below. Until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you later.
Future episodes may feature a variety of topics, ranging from storytelling, arts and crafts, reader's advisory, reference questions, discussion, and more. We also encourage feedback through our Facebook page or in the comments section on the podcast. Visit us online at www.wicomicolibraries.org. Search for Wicomico Libraries on your favorite podcasting site. You can call us at 410-546-5397, or you can email us at center@wicomico.org. That is CENTRE @wicomico.org.